So I put a poll up a while ago asking between a few series you guys wanted to see, and Danganronpa won by a wide margin. I can't say I'm too surprised, honestly. The series in recent years has gotten a huge spike of popularity, and now the games are coming to Switch, which will make it grow even more at this point. Though for me, I first heard about the series, I want to say, back in junior year of high school, when a friend of mine was showing us the trailer as the game was being localized. It looked interesting to me. I was already playing through the Ace Attorney series at this point, so when it did come out, I borrowed my friend's PSP, played it through, and that was about it, honestly. I didn't think too much of it after. I did watch the anime adaptation long after its run, but I didn't feel a desire to go forward with the series. That was until I started streaming it and did playthroughs through both 2 and V3. Now I had a few people asking me how was this gonna work for a review since DR is a visual novel, meaning it's more story focused than anything I've done for a main review yet. So here's how it's gonna work. Each of these videos for the games is being broken into 2 parts. Part 1 is my normal review style with no spoilers, so people can see if I can recommend the game or not. I'll make sure to cover up any character deaths or the like to make sure it's a spoiler-free journey. Don't worry. And part 2 is going to be the spoiler video where I go over strictly the story stuff and talk about stuff that I couldn't talk about in the first video without giving away plot details. Sound good? Alright, so what is Danganronpa? Okay, first off, question, how is it actually pronounced? I got the main theme saying Danganronpa, but I got the menu sound test in V3 saying
Danganronpa V3!
Well, since I'm getting conflicting information, I'll probably interchange between the two subconsciously. Don't care? No? Good, let's move on. Well, Danganronpa started its life off when Spike, later known as Spike Chunsoft, wanted to branch out into a new game with their own IP instead of using others, and Kazutaka Kodaka came up with the idea for a murder mystery game involving high schoolers where a killer was among themselves and the player would have to find out who did it. The first version of this game was called Distrust, named after the mechanic where the characters would either trust or distrust you based on actions you took in the game. This would lead to multiple branching pathways and endings for the game. But this pitch was overall scrapped because it was considered too hard to understand the concept, and the company gave the team a very small budget, so it would need to be more simple. This had him apparently cutting out visual novel elements and making it a, and I quote, high-speed detective action game. It's a visual novel. And turned it into Execution High School and the Students of Despair, which is honestly an even more generic name than Distrust if you ask me. But later on, Kodaka and his team would settle with the name Danganronpa, which in Japanese translates to Bullet Refutation, based on the main gameplay mechanic where you would have to shoot down people's arguments. And this pitch was approved and later released in Japan on the PSP in 2010.
The most interesting part about Danganronpa's development history is its journey to the West, because we wouldn't get the game until 2014 with the Vita version. That's a long time to wait, but fans found their workarounds.
So nowadays when you think of Let's Plays, you're probably thinking of something you can find on YouTube or watching Twitch streams. Well, for Danganronpa, its first one was a forum Let's Play. In 2011, on the Something Awful forums, a text-based Let's Play of the game was being done by the user Orinorin, essentially translating the game and putting the sprites on the post as a sort of recreation of the game, taking the visual part of the visual novel quite literally. Anyway, the playthrough started to gain attention and fandoms were starting up as it was the first major exposure people had to the series. It wasn't without its problems though, as later they would start putting up paywalls for the latest chapters, and they started a playthrough for the second game, but only got about halfway through before ending the project. But hope did shine through with a fully playable fan translation for the first game on the original PSP. This would be my first exposure to the game playing off of my friend's PSP as I said before. After this, Spike Chunsoft started to notice the excitement for it overseas and started on translations for the first 2 games that would be released on the more modern Vita. And 2 years later, these would be ported to Steam, where I feel is where the series really started to pick up momentum, mainly because it was no longer tied to a dwindling handheld. Poor Vita, an honestly awesome system that was just too far ahead for its own time, honestly. But the Steam version is the one I'll be playing for all 3 of the mainline games. but every version released after the Vita are based on the reload versions of the game, which have some extra content in DR1, including a whole new post-game. And Anniversary Edition on phones and Switch, I looked into this, I couldn't really find any differences other than the name for these. I think it's just a branding thing, so play it on whatever platform you want. You're getting the same experience regardless.
So with that out of the way, let's dive into Danganronpa.
So in Danganronpa, you take control of Makoto Naegi, an average high school student chosen to attend Hope's Peak Academy, a school that trains the best of the best in their talent, such as becoming an idol, a baseball star, an illegal bike gang member, you know, the usual. These ultimates, or super high school leveled in other versions, are students that are basically guaranteed success upon graduating here. How much of that number do you think the school is inflating? Now, Makoto ended up going to the school by winning a lottery to it, and is referred to as the ultimate lucky student. Question: how do you train luck? Do you just, continually gamble all the time? Is that how you do it? Well, those are questions for later/never, as when he steps foot into Hope's Peak, he passes out and finds the entire school has been boarded up, and neither him nor his 14 other classmates can figure out what's going on. That is until this tiny bear named Monokuma shows up. Fun fact, he was originally a human in his beta design, and I don't know, I don't think the series would really pick up with this design being the mascot. Well, anyway, the bear announces that the 15 of them are now in the killing game. What is said game? Well, in order to escape the school, one student needs to kill another and be able to get away with the crime. If they're found out, the culprit, or the blackened as they're referred to, will be executed. But if the group gets the culprit wrong, the rest of them will be executed and the real culprit will be freed. And that's pretty much as much of a synopsis as I can give. So we got a Battle Royale inspired death game here, and I mean the Japanese film Battle Royale, not, the game genre. And overall, the concept works. It's naturally a good setup for characters, as you can put them in horrible situations and find out who they really are as people and the like. Plus you got stories for individual cases, though this game the cases are very episodic. Not many of them directly tie into one another. And as for the overarching plot here, it's there, but it's very in the background for this title, only really coming into full force by the end of the game. And that's about all I can get into now until part 2, so let's move over to something that I can talk about. So Danganronpa 1 was made on a very tight budget since Spike wasn't sure about the series' success, and I think they did an alright job. Environments are rendered in 3D for the main school, while individual rooms and all the characters remain as 2D objects, creating a sort of pop-up book look, and I think it looks rather nice. The school itself could use a bit more decoration. Seriously, for an elite school, it sure does have a bland interior, but the individual rooms have a lot more detail and do a good job representing their locations. And I also like how the trial room keeps a different aesthetic for each chapter, which is a nice touch. Also, unlike games like Ace Attorney, all the trials are fully voice acted, and playing through the game with the English dub, it's okay-ish. I know for many of these actors it was very early in their careers when this game came out, but while some characters are good enough, I feel like there's something going on with the direction, because the entire cast feels stiff. Like they weren't able to get into it that much, or were told to hold back, and it can hurt some scenes. And unfortunately, I put the soundtrack in the same boat. It's not that it's bad, and there's some tracks I do like, such as Closing Argument and Reenactment, which is the main theme, but I like this version more. The investigation theme, though it does reset after every time you get a new truth bullet, which does get old when you hear dun 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 dun, and New World Order, though I think the track loops a little too much. But there wasn't any track that I love per se. I think the soundtrack has two big problems for me. One, the game ends up playing the same 5 tracks way too many times, to the point where they really start to lose their impact fast. And 2, I feel like the music is too much in the background and doesn't emphasize a scene. Ace Attorney fans, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When a song plays, there's a big punch to drive in the emotion home. In DR1, the song just kind of plays. That's about it. it lacks punch, making it feel underemphasized. There's a great video out on YouTube by Kanish, I think I'm pronouncing that right, where they took Trial 1 and replaced it with Ace Attorney music and timed it up for emphasis on certain moments. Watch that and watch regular Chapter 1 Trial, and you can really see how the timing and impact of music can really sell a scene, and I never felt that in this game. Honestly, the most emphasis the music has is when it doesn't play. And yes, the blood is pink. It's just a thing in the series, roll with it. But speaking of death, the series is also known for its executions, and they're okay. I think some of these work with the 2.5D animation better than others, but I wasn't impressed by that many in this one. And the presentation in some like Chapter 2, 3, and 4, I think hurt those in particular. You also have the game's character designs, which if you haven't played a game in the series, you've probably seen one of these guys somewhere online or at a con. And I think for the most part, they're good in this one. I would say in pure design, characters like Celeste, Sakura, Mondo, and Kyoko are the winners for me in this one. The rest can look a little generic, but it gets the job done. Honestly, I think the biggest praise I have visually for the game goes to the closing arguments that have a very rough line manga art style that really works well in selling the stories that are being told. I can't say the same for the drawn stills seen throughout the game that look rough now and don't really mesh with the game's style, honestly. I think it's trying to look a little too realistic in its shading techniques. It kinda clashes, and these totally were meant to be on a PSP because the aliasing on them doesn't look great being blown up. So overall, I think Danganronpa 1 is good enough presentation-wise, but how about the gameplay? The gameplay of Danganronpa is split up into 3 sections: daily life, investigation, and class trial. In daily life, you briefly discuss about the events that happened in the story, and you explore a new section of the school that has opened up to you. Afterwards, you get free time where you can chat with any of the remaining students as you please and try to learn more about them, and I really do mean try. And you can give them presents to raise your affinity with them, making it easier to get a new event. Each time you do so, you get either more skill points or a new skill that you can equip to use in a class trial, but more on that in a bit. I am jumping a bit ahead here, but once you beat the game in every version the Vita on, you have school mode, which is pretty much a what-if scenario if Monokuma started the killing game a bit too early before everything was set up. So you have this whole gathering material side quest to get trip tickets, to do further hangouts with students if you want, but this mode is pretty much here to get the free times you weren't able to get in the main story. But once a good old body has been discovered, then it's time to start investigating, where you talk up with everyone around you for information and click on interactables to examine them, until that bell kicks in and it's time to head down below for the class trial. And don't worry, you can't miss anything. The game won't go to trial unless you have everything you need. I hear that misconception time to time, and I just wanted to clear that up. So in said class trial, your main gameplay style will be make your argument, in which your evidence will become truth bullets. In this, you go through characters' lines of dialogue until you find something that your evidence can contradict. You also have white noise, or pink noise, that you can shoot down to add some more time to your counter. There's also times where the bullets you have won't line up with anything anyone else is saying, so you will instead need to absorb a point that someone else takes and then fire that as a bullet instead, hogging all that glory for yourself like the little pro tag you are. There are 3 other minigames that show up from time to time. One is Hangman's Gambit, where you need to spell out a word that they want related to the case, and bullet time battles are when you get into a heated argument with someone and you need to keep a beat as it gets faster and faster in a rhythm game. And closing argument, where you need to recreate the entire scene, filling in the blanks. You also have a speed up and slow down feature in all of these, giving you a clearer shot or speed back to a part of an argument that you need to access. But get too many points wrong and you cause a game over, where everyone suspects you being the culprit even if you had nothing to do with the case and you have a solid alibi. What? And you have skills that you can equip, such as extra health, more focus, all of that good stuff. And that's about it for the gameplay of Trigger Happy Havoc. So what did this first outing get right? So, the good in DR1, let's see here. Well, I think gameplay in the actual class trials remains fun throughout. I do think make your argument does lead to a good feeling every time I get a contradiction right, Plus, I always do like the touch that you can speed up or slow down arguments, and it affects the voices as well, which was always charming. I actually really like the entire idea behind closing argument, and it ends cases on satisfying notes. Honestly, closing argument is probably the most consistent in quality minigame of the entire series. And this first attempt, while it does have some issues where if you get one wrong, it boots you out, breaking the immersion, it still works well. There are some characters in this cast I end up really liking, and I do think the game starts off strong. Case 1 does a great job misdirecting you and having your expectations flip, and Case 2 I think is the highlight of the game, where the case is going in all sorts of directions and having great moments throughout. Those two cases are where the game is at its peak in my opinion. Unfortunately, there's a lot more game here and the rest. Danganronpa 1 definitely has problems, but as for the ones I can mention without spoilers, well, to gameplay stuff first. In the class trials, there are things I'm not a big fan of. Hangman's Gambit honestly gets boring pretty fast. I mean, it's relatively okay, but it just feels there. It doesn't really add anything to the trials in my opinion. I think Bullet Time Battle has it a bit better, but it quickly loses luster and doesn't feel that exciting in later trials. But the bigger part of the trials I don't like is the absorbing statements. Already choosing between your multiple bullets and statements can sometimes get tricky enough, but now you need to also consider your own bullets and what's being said for more possible combinations, and only one of them is right. Doesn't help when statements can kind of feel similar, driving that issue even more. It doesn't really feel like it adds anything to trials, especially since instead of having others contribute to the debate, Makoto most of the time just takes the statement like it was his own, which doesn't really help as many of the trials kind of devolve into the Makoto, Kyoko, and Byakuya show, as they figure out the mystery while everyone else just kind of watches. Also, I didn't mention it earlier, but it's a super minor thing, but in the game, there's this reaction system where you press a button when talking to a character that has purple text. It's honestly pointless and just continues mandatory text anyway, so it's easy to see why no other game in the series has this. The next one is a small thing, but the vending machine that you use to get gifts for free time events, the animation is honestly just a bit too long and it adds up over time. But this next one isn't so small. There's a running joke in the community to not get attached to anyone because, you know, they're gonna die. But I think DR1 makes that job a little easier than it should be. I don't like a good majority of this cast. Most don't grow, stay one note in their characters, or actively go out of their way to make me really not like them, both intentionally and unintentionally. And this is a key factor because Danganronpa is a very character-focused game, as it doesn't spend much time exploring its world and relies on its characters to drive the plot forward. So when they don't work for me, it drags a lot of the plot down with it. It's like a reality TV show where for that season they just have a bad group of people, and after the two likable ones are taken out, you really lose incentive to keep following.
I can count the total amount of characters I at minimum like on one hand, and there's 15 of them. It's not a great look.
Contributing to that feeling is the pacing and lack of extraneous scenes. The game's pacing is very breakneck from the beginning of a chapter to the start of trial. It was normally like an hour and a half, so it's clear they want you to focus on the trials. But honestly, it feels like cases start up way too fast, so just as people were even starting to reflect on what just happened, they're right in the middle of another murder. Almost as if they were scared that the player was gonna get too bored if there isn't action happening. And as such, there's really not times for characters to sit down, think things through, interact, have any kind of meaningful connections, which would add more for when a murder actually does happen and give the cases more weight. And you may say, well, that's where the free time events come in, but man, in this game, they just kinda suck. There are some good ones like Mondo, Sakura, and Taka are ones I can think of off the top of my head, but the greater 70% of these conversations just feed into character stereotypes and give you nothing that you would have known otherwise about the character. Some actually made me like the character even less looking at you, Hiro and Celeste. And for the record, I did do every single one of them thanks to school mode, so yeah, the pool's pretty dry on that end too. Not to mention some characters are given way more events than others, and that leads into issues where characters that have shorter ones you wish you got more of, and some characters get full sets of events, but you learn next to nothing about or are even that interesting. And without those bonding moments, the game is just chugging along at full speed. It really makes the game not nearly as engaging as its opening. While Case 1 and 2 are good starts, well, you may have heard this thing called third case syndrome. It's attributed a lot to games like Ace Attorney and Danganronpa. And while I say it only applies sometimes to Ace Attorney, it depends on the game, Danganronpa unfortunately falls into this trap throughout the entire series. Case 3 is a whole bunch of nothing and one of the weakest cases in the series. Case 4, okay, I need to go into more in my spoilers later, but I feel like the case itself is fine, but there's a lot of character issues that make it a weak chapter in my eyes. Again, I'll explain more of that in part 2. And the finale of the game is easily the weakest part of the whole adventure, and it left a sour taste in my mouth. And how much does that say about the game as a whole if I only enjoyed the first few hours of the game?
Danganronpa 1 definitely feels like a first game in the series. You can feel a lot of growing pains with this one. And honestly, the later part of the game loses sight of what made it fun in the first place. And when I only enjoy 1/3 of the entire package, what can I say?
Overall, Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc is alright. I mean, the game itself is fine, but I feel like it burns out too fast. And the rest of the game is pretty underwhelming after its strong burst at the beginning. My biggest problem with recommending it peaks too early. I only feel positive about 2 out of the 6 cases, and they're both right at the beginning, so it makes it hard to say to keep playing after that point. Combined with characters I don't really enjoy, gameplay that can get a little repetitious after a while, and DR1 really feels dated playing it now, both in gameplay and writing. I know this is the first game in the series, but I don't know, man. Ace Attorney 1 is almost 10 years older, and that game doesn't feel nearly as dated as this. And after this review, I don't think I'm gonna go back to it much in the future. I might be showing my hand early on this, but out of the 3 main games of the series, DR1 I feel is easily the weakest of the bunch. And the only reason I can recommend it is because later games story-wise jump off of this, and I think you gain a lot more appreciation for changes in later games. So DR1 as a standalone game, I don't think I would really recommend this one.
And that was Danganronpa 1. Again, part 2 is going to come out pretty soon, but I'm going to need a little bit of time. It's a beefy video, so I got a lot to talk about. But for my next Danganronpa review, it's going to be on Danganronpa 2, Goodbye Despair. I'll see you then.